There are moments in history when a single word can spark chaos. When a speech echoes through the bones of a people. When fear walks quietly into a room and no one notices until the world is on fire. War does not begin with weapons. It begins with minds. Long before the first shot is fired, the battle is already raging inside us. The psychology of war is not something distant or reserved for generals and soldiers. It lives in ordinary people, in their anger, pride, pain, and fear. It creeps into daily life disguised as patriotism, justice, vengeance, or defense. And once it takes hold, it begins to whisper, "You must fight. You must protect. You must destroy." The first thing war attacks is clarity. In times of peace, we think we understand the world. We believe people are rational, that things will be okay. But war thrives on uncertainty. It feeds on confusion. And the human brain, so uncomfortable with chaos, searches for answers, for someone to blame, for action to take, even if that action leads to destruction. There is something ancient inside us. A part of the mind evolved not for comfort or cooperation, but for survival. In the wild, long before cities or flags or nations, humans learned to band together in groups. Not just for warmth or food, but to fight the others. Survival meant seeing strangers as threats. The moment we feared someone, they became less human. And that habit never left us. Modern war is complex. The weapons are advanced. The politics are tangled. But the psychology remains primitive. At its core, war is still about the same thing: protecting the tribe, defeating the enemy, proving we are strong, ensuring we are not erased. Every war begins with a story. A story of injustice. A story of betrayal. A story that says, "We are good. They are evil. We must do something." And the more painful the past, the more powerful the story becomes. Nations carry old wounds the way people do. They remember every scar, every humiliation, every loss. They pass these memories down through generations, not always in words, but in feelings, in traditions, in the stories told at dinner tables. Sometimes, those stories are true. Real pain. Real suffering. And sometimes, they are twisted, reshaped by fear and pride until they no longer reflect the past, but the fear of repeating it. Either way, the result is the same: a readiness to fight again. But war is not just about fear. It's also about identity. Who we believe we are. And more dangerously, who we believe we are not. When conflict looms, people look inward. They cling to their flags, their religions, their accents, their land. Identity becomes armor. Anything that threatens it, even a different way of thinking, feels like an attack. The brain reacts as if it's being physically threatened. Rational thought becomes clouded. Compassion fades. And instead of saying, "Let's understand each other," we say, "Let's destroy them before they destroy us." This is not weakness. It is wiring. In times of danger, the brain simplifies everything. Complex people become simple categories: friend or foe, ally or traitor. We forget that the enemy also feels fear. That they, too, believe they are doing what's right. That their story is just as real to them as ours is to us. And so, misunderstanding deepens. One side prepares. The other reacts. Back and forth. Each escalation justified by the last. No one wants war, they say. But no one wants to back down either. Pride gets louder. Diplomacy gets quieter. And soon, there is no way out that doesn't look like surrender. Before long, war no longer feels like a choice. It feels inevitable. But inevitability is a trick of the mind. It's a story we tell ourselves to avoid facing our own fears, our own limits, our own egos. We say there was no other option, because admitting we had a choice would mean accepting the consequences of not choosing peace. The truth is, war is not just about the enemy. It's about ourselves. It's about the parts of us that crave power, that fear weakness, that want revenge, that feel invisible. It's about the leaders who promise strength but deliver suffering. It's about the lies we believe to feel safe. The myths we cling to instead of doing the hard work of understanding. And perhaps most tragically, it's about what we teach our children. Because war never ends on the battlefield. Its shadows stretch far beyond the front lines. It lives in the homes left empty. In the sons who never come back. In the girls who grow up too fast. In the dreams that die too soon. And in the stories that remain, passed down again, ready to spark the next fight. But here's the deeper truth. War also reveals something else, the aching desire for peace. No one truly wants to suffer. No mother wants to bury her child. No soldier wants to wake from nightmares for the rest of his life. Even those who call for war do so because they believe it will end their fear, restore their dignity, prove their worth. That's the tragedy of war. It's a cry for peace, shouted in the most violent way. If we could stop for a moment, if we could pause before the fight, before the flags, before the hate, and listen to what we're really afraid of, we might find something else. A chance. A choice. But that takes courage. Not the courage to fight. The courage to see ourselves clearly. To ask, why do I feel threatened? What am I really protecting? And who told me this enemy must be destroyed for me to be whole? That's where healing begins. Not with politics. Not with treaties. But with awareness. With the quiet bravery of looking inward. Because before peace is ever declared in the world, it must first be made in the mind. As fear takes root, individuals begin to merge into something larger, something more driven by group identity than by personal conscience. When war arrives, we don't just act as ourselves, we act as representatives of our tribe, nation, or ideology. And in that transformation, something subtle and dangerous happens. The lines between them and us become sharper, louder, more enforceable. In the hours before a conflict becomes public, the language around it changes. Media, officials, and communities begin to speak differently. A person becomes an opponent. A disagreement becomes a threat. Minor infractions are called betrayal. Increasingly, rhetoric frames the enemy as monolithic, untrustworthy, and dangerous. This shift is not accidental, it is a crafted process known as dehumanization. As soon as you see someone as other, empathy falters. Their pain becomes less real. You may not feel joy when they suffer, but you also don't feel anger when they perish. In the controlled silence of dehumanization, violence finds moral cover. It begins to feel necessary. It's not cruelty. It's familiarity. It feels instinctually right because emotion is being reshaped by fear and story. The brain suppresses nuance so it can act quickly. It stops perceiving individuals and begins labeling faults, traitor, enemy, rebel. Suddenly, violence is not just plausible, it is inevitable. Groups reinforce this by creating narratives of historical grievance. 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago, it doesn't matter. The story lives in the collective imagination. It's repeated in schools, memorials, family stories. It becomes truth. And anyone who questions that story is cast as denial, another form of threat. Within this climate, group psychology becomes both shield and fuel. Individuals who may never have wanted war begin to conform to the group's expectations. Dissent is discouraged, ostracized, punished. Acknowledge sympathy for the other side? You risk being labeled a traitor. Stay silent about atrocities? You align with horror. So people comply, and in compliance, their inner moral compass shifts outward toward the group's ethics. This process isn't reserved for extremists. Ordinary people, teachers, doctors, parents, find themselves following the tide. They begin acting not out of personal conviction, but out of shared momentum. Their choices feel collectivized. What we are doing collectively. And any hesitation feels unpatriotic, cowardly, endangered to the whole. At the personal level, friendships fracture as identities polarize. Neighbors who once argued gently about politics begin shouting insults. churches, clubs, schools, social groups, all draw lines in the sand. The war becomes both internal and external. Inside, families struggle. Outside, rhetoric intensifies. People start to lie more. They embellish stories about the enemy. They justify violence by focusing on real or alleged acts of cruelty. They omit the counter-narrative so thoroughly that when war arrives, it feels prophetic. Everything becomes expected. This is how collective psychology transforms conflict from possibility into inevitability. Each small choice, a reposted article, a murmured slur, a silent nod, feeds the momentum. Years before troops march, hate is cultivated in neighborhoods, forums, coffee shops. It comes in jokes, in stories, in complaints. Subtle messages repeat, they're dangerous. They're less than us. They deserve what's coming. And in that reiteration, humans become enemies rather than neighbors. Walls go up in minds before they go up in cities. Barriers replace bridges. But there is also a hidden force resisting this, compassion in spite of the story. In moments when individuals see the humanity in a stranger. When someone hears accounts from the other side and their world shifts. These moments often happen quietly, secretly, embarrassingly. A soldier meets a civilian from the other side. A refugee's face on the news prompts heartbreak. A teacher shares personal stories across national lines. These cracks remind us, identity is taught, and it can be untaught. War psychology thrives by erasing these cracks. It magnifies cohesion by silencing empathy. That's why resistance isn't public. It's personal. It begins when someone chooses not to repeat the narrative. When they name a friend across the line. When they question slogans on their way to the parade. Resistance is rare because it's lonely. But it's powerful because it shows choice still exists. Conflict escalates in part because collective psychology tells us we must escalate. Weapons feel necessary. Borders feel necessary. Retribution feels necessary. Peace talks feel expensive or naive. And the more time passes, the more illegible diplomacy becomes. Each side loses sight of the person. They see only the posture, aggression, defense, readiness to die for the cause. Under this fog, cruelty no longer registers as cruelty, it registers as needed cruelty. It is strategy. It is deterrence. It is survival. Empathy becomes vulnerability. To care feels like weakness. This transformation can be undone, not with treaties alone, but by slowly thawing collective conviction. By reconnecting with individual stories. By centering empathy as resistance. By recognizing that dehumanization is political, not biological. That enemies are invented, not born. Because the moment any listener asks, what does the enemy feel, the psychology begins to crumble. The black and white story cracks, and complexity returns. Part 2 concludes with this heartbeat. War doesn't merely exist in weapons and commands. It is forged in silent compliance, discipline, repetition, and denial. And undone in private acts of empathy, even when they feel small or unnoticed. Fear and group identity begin a war. But trauma and rage sustain it. When violence occurs, explosions echo, homes burn, lives shatter, the emotional shock doesn't end. It multiplies. The body registers pain as a warning. The mind labels the culprit. A wound forms. That wound often demands justice or revenge. It begins small, a name shouted, a slogan turned hashtag, a memory preached and sharpened. It accumulates. You who once sought peace now find yourself haunted by images of destruction. Loved ones lost. Homes turned to rubble. This isn't weakness. It's intensity. Trauma rewrites the emotional map. Danger becomes defined not by current risk but by anticipation. Each new threat triggers ancient alarms. Retribution becomes reassurance. If they hurt us, making them hurt back restores a fragile equilibrium. This is how cycles begin. They grow through retaliation and retaliation in turn. Attack demands counterattack. Each side claims victimhood. Each believes the other's violence justifies their own. Pain becomes license. Rage justifies strategy. And empathy dies. What keeps cycles going is not strategy alone, it's emotional contagion. Anger passes through crowds like a virus. In social media, war rooms, rallies, the collective mind amplifies rage until reason dims. The wounded person becomes the wounded identity. There is memory and momentum, every voice echoing the hurt. It reinforces the story, they attacked first. We must respond. Trauma also reshapes personal ethics. People who never thought themselves capable of violence find justifications. Group loyalty becomes a higher law. The logic goes, if not us, then who? If not now, then when? When loyalty demands action, morality often concedes. Individual conscience yields to collective imperative. And when retaliation escalates, it becomes predictable. So does suffering. Cities fall. Families displace. Memories harden into doctrine. Monuments rise over buried grief. New generations learn not stories of reconciliation but of superiority masked by sorrow. That's how war outlives its origins. It becomes identity. It lives past the ceasefire. It lives in grief. It lives in re-education. And often, it never admits it's over. Still, even amidst trauma, humans seek meaning. They need it. And so, narratives form to give grief a name. They tell war stories not as chaos, but as necessity. Not as tragedy, but as righteousness. Pain becomes a badge. Suffering becomes justification. Martyrs become icons. In that cycle, even peace is suspect. Offers of reconciliation are judged against the depth of injury. Forgiveness becomes treason. And so retaliation continues. Because identity now fears peace more than war. Peace feels like forgetting. Peace feels like weakness. Breaking the cycle isn't just political, it's psychological. Trauma must be witnessed. Rage must be acknowledged. Enemy narratives must be humanized. Cry and confession must accompany ceasefire. Otherwise, war stays alive in memory. Healing begins when families on both sides mourn. Healing begins when leaders admit their side caused harm, not just received it. Healing begins when humanity is restored, not erased, across the line. But that takes courage, to look at your own side's wounds, and wounds you inflicted. To hold pain while saying no more. To refuse to pass trauma forward. This is where psychology and peace converge, in the decision to stop retaliating. To stop giving the cycle permission to continue. To say, our story will no longer be rage. Because until the trauma-wounded people, when their stories remain unspoken, war stays unfinished. Healing war's psychology means finishing it emotionally. And that begins with small acts, acknowledgement. Compassion. Naming. Wounded words, finally spoken. Tears, finally shed. Silence, finally broken. In that space lies possibility for truth, apology, and perhaps something else, hope. Inside the relentless cycle of conflict, something begins to stir, though not in public halls, not on battlefield maps, but in whispers and private decisions. In one person choosing compassion over cohesion. In another acknowledging the pain their side caused. In dialogue that transcends slogans and focuses on humanity. This is where true resistance begins, not with weapons, but with empathy. Not with agreements, but with awareness. Individuals who pause in the noise, who wonder what does the other side feel, create cracks in the group's conviction. Someone who asks the difficult question, what if our narrative exaggerates their threat, threatens the solidity of justifying war? Resistance doesn't need mass movements to exist, it begins with personal moral acts. Psychologically, standing out from the crowd is painful. In war culture, dissent is dangerous. But those who resist infractions, lie after lie, atrocity after atrocity, refuse to participate in dehumanization. They name violations. They speak of escape, exile, regret. They testify. These individual cracks can grow. When one soldier refuses to obey an illegal command. When one journalist documents both sides. When survivors of violence speak truth about the enemy, not to exonerate, but to humanize. Resistance also requires accountability. Without admission, apology, restitution, conflict stays open. 10,000 wounds, closed eyes don't heal. Collective healing demands confession, vulnerability, structural response. It demands the powerful name what they inflicted, not only what they suffered. That reversal shifts the collective psyche from siege to responsibility. When leaders genuinely acknowledge harm to the other side, the emotional architecture changes. Deterrence softens into regret. Strategy becomes reconciliation. Politics becomes fragile but possible. These psychological shifts often begin quietly: truth commissions, shared memorials, dialogues, art across the lines. They involve bearing witness to each other's loss, not to score moral points, but to recognize sorrow. These acts don't erase trauma. They integrate it. Resistance also thrives in cross-group empathy: soldiers who set down weapons in favor of peace. Doctors who treat enemy combatants. Families who share stories with former adversaries. These small acts yield emotional proof: not all who carry arms seek death. Not all who experience loss demand vengeance. Breaking the loop doesn't happen overnight. It's not linear. Trauma recoils. Some people recoil. Some rage. Some retreat into hardened denial. But each act of empathy is a ripple. Each act of accountability loosens the grip of collective memory. Each confession humanizes at least one listener. And that is the emotional foundation for lasting peace. Not treaties sealed in grand gestures, but quiet trust built one story at a time, mediated not by power, but by understanding. When cycles break and new narratives emerge, something bigger begins: the possibility of peace, not as a ceasefire on maps, but as emotional freedom in fractured minds. True peace doesn't look like victory. It looks like restoration. Like rebuilding homes and relationships left in rubble. Like redefining identity, not by what was lost, but by what's possible. Healing starts with individuals and expands outward. Those who've witnessed both sides of suffering become guides. Communities that listen rather than shout become seeds. Relationships forged in the rubble become proof connection can return after rupture. Psychologically, the journey is long. It's about teaching the body safety again. Teaching minds to trust nuance over certainty. It's about learning that grieving doesn't dilute identity, it enriches it. That empathy is not weakness, but resilience. Collective peace needs inward journeys. Each citizen, survivor, former soldier, leader must ask, how am I still stained by the conflict? What stories do I carry? What forgiveness must I offer, of myself, of the other? Reimagining identity becomes key. If identity once meant armed loyalty, now it must mean ethical community. If trauma once demanded vengeance, now it must demand transformation. Practically, this means policies aligned with justice, reparations, education, cultural exchange. It means creating space for shared narratives, poems, songs, memorials that bear witness across lines. It means inviting the voices of the most wounded, who can teach the rest what pain really is, and why war mustn't repeat. At the strongest point of peace psychology lies this paradox: love doesn't erase memory, but it renders it meaningful. Peace doesn't erase pain, but it fills it with possibility. Connection doesn't remove loss, but it ensures loss is not final. If you've ever felt despair watching war unfold, know this: healing begins in the mind before maps of ceasefire are drawn. Each individual choice to see another as human, to refuse hate, to grieve across lines, to speak truth, these are psychological acts of resistance that become peace. So rest. Reflect. Begin locally, with your assumptions, your empathy, your stories. Share them. Let them ripple outward. Accept that restoration may take a century, but every step toward seeing the other side lifts a burden. Each apology softens a heart. Each story transforms memory into meaning. As we close this exploration of the psychology of war, remember, if fear is the engine of conflict, empathy is the fuel of peace. If identity binds us in conflict, shared humanity frees us. In reconciliation. If cycles persist in sorrow, healing begins when someone dares to believe peace is possible, not as myth, but as a daily practice. Your mind holds both war's wound and peace's promise. Choose connection. Choose care. Choose release. Because in the end, the most radical act may be to stop fighting inside and begin healing.